I've always been the invisible daughter in our family, the reliable one who stays after hours at our family business while my sister collects the praise. When my parents handed her keys to a brand new BMW at Christmas dinner, while I unwrapped wool socks, something finally broke inside me. 2 months later, when they announced my sister would take over the company I'd practically been running for years, I made a decision that would shock everyone, including myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Donovan family Christmas dinner had always been an elaborate affair. My mother, Elaine, spent days preparing, arranging the antique china that had belonged to my grandmother, polishing the silver until it gleamed, and decorating our sprawling Victorian home with evergreen garlands that filled the house with the scent of pine. This year was no different, except perhaps for the additional sparkle in my parents' eyes as they welcomed everyone into the dining room. I arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bottle of Cabernet that had cost more than I should have spent and a carefully wrapped selection of gourmet chocolates for my father. Despite working 70-hour weeks at Donovan Financial Group, the wealth management firm my grandfather had founded and my father had expanded, I still felt the familiar pressure to prove my worth every time I entered my childhood home. "Victoria!" my mother exclaimed, air-kissing both my cheeks. "You're right on time. Everyone else is already here." Of course they were. My sister Isabel had probably been here for hours, helping with preparations while simultaneously being treated like an honored guest. That was Isabel's particular talent, appearing helpful while being catered to. Meanwhile, I'd spent the day at the office finalizing the Henderson portfolio that my father had forgotten about, but that needed to be completed before the holiday break. I followed my mother into the dining room where my father stood by the fireplace, one arm draped around Isabel's shoulders as they laughed together. At 32, just 2 years younger than me, Isabel maintained the golden girl aura that had defined her since childhood. Her marketing degree from an expensive private university had earned her the title of Creative Director at Donovan Financial, a position created specifically for her that mainly involved occasional social media posts and attending industry parties. "There she is!" Dad called, his face brightening at the sight of me, though not quite reaching the wattage it displayed for Isabel, our numbers wizard. The nickname stung as always. Not Victoria the leader or Victoria the visionary, just the calculator, the reliable processor of data. I kissed his cheek and handed him the chocolates, which he accepted with a distracted thanks before turning back to my sister. Isabel was just telling me about her idea for the new client welcome package. Very innovative. Isabel beamed. "I'm thinking custom leather portfolios with the client's name embossed in gold. Luxury conveys confidence." I bit back the observation that such portfolios would cost nearly $200 each, and our profit margins couldn't support such extravagance. I'd learned long ago that practical concerns like budgets and ROI calculations weren't welcome when Isabel was sharing her creative vision. "Sounds impressive," I offered instead, moving toward my grandfather who sat in his customary wingback chair. At 84, Maxwell Donovan remained sharp-minded, though physically frail. He was the only family member who seemed to truly see my contributions to the firm he'd built from nothing. "Victoria," he said, his eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. "Come tell me about the Henderson account. Richard mentioned you've been handling it." As I sat beside him, detailing the complex portfolio restructuring I'd implemented that would save the client nearly $80,000 in taxes, I felt myself relaxing slightly. Grandpa Maxwell listened attentively, asking incisive questions that demonstrated his continued grasp of the business. When I finished, he patted my hand approvingly. "Excellent work. The business is lucky to have you." Before I could respond, my mother called everyone to the table. I took my usual seat beside my cousin Derek, who worked in the firm's compliance department, another essential but largely invisible role. He gave me a knowing smile as we unfolded our napkins in unison. "Another day, another dollar," he murmured, our traditional greeting that acknowledged our shared position as the family workhorses. Dinner proceeded with the usual conversation patterns. Dad dominated, speaking enthusiastically about the firm's record year, while my mother interjected, with perfect hostess questions designed to give everyone a moment in the conversation. Isabel described her recent business trip to New York, though I knew from the expense reports that crossed my desk that she'd spent more time shopping than meeting with potential clients. When I mentioned the new portfolio analysis system I'd implemented that had increased efficiency by 30%, my father nodded absently before turning to ask my brother-in-law about his golf game. I caught Grandpa's sympathetic glance and managed a small smile in return. After the main course, my mother disappeared briefly before returning with an unusually excited expression. "I think it's time for gifts," she announced, though we typically exchanged presents on Christmas morning, not Christmas Eve dinner. "Yes," my father agreed, standing up with surprising energy for a man who'd just consumed 2 helpings of prime rib. "Let's move to the living room." The unexpected change in tradition left me momentarily confused, but I followed the family procession to the elaborately decorated living room where our Christmas tree stretched nearly to the ceiling. Beneath it were several wrapped packages, including 1 large box and 1 very small one. "Isabel first," my father declared, handing her the larger box with barely contained excitement. Isabel made a show of carefully removing the wrapping paper, though her eyes gleamed with anticipation. As she lifted the lid, her practiced composure broke into genuine shock. "No way!" she gasped, pulling out a small rectangular box that I immediately recognized as a car key case embossed with the BMW logo. "You didn't!" "We did!" My mother clapped her hands together. "It's parked in the garage right now. The white X5 you've been admiring." Isabel screamed, actually screamed, and threw her arms around our father. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. Thank you." As the commotion continued, with everyone following Isabel toward the garage to admire her new luxury SUV worth at least $65,000, my mother paused to hand me the small package that remained. "This is for you, dear," she said before hurrying after the others. Alone in the suddenly quiet living room, I unwrapped the small box with steady hands that belied the hollowness spreading through my chest. Inside, neatly folded, were 2 pairs of wool socks, 1 dark blue, 1 gray. Practical, sensible, just like Victoria. The absurdity was so complete that I couldn't even feel angry. I simply sat there holding $12 worth of socks while the excited voices from the garage exclaimed, over leather seats and dashboard features. When everyone filtered back into the living room, cheeks flushed with excitement, my mother glanced at me. "Did you open yours, Victoria?" I held up the socks with what I hoped was a neutral expression. "Yes, thank you. Very practical." I remembered. "You said your feet get cold in that apartment of yours," she explained. "The heater still not working properly?" "It's fine," I replied, though I'd never mentioned any heating issues. My loft apartment was actually quite comfortable. Not that anyone in my family had visited to know that. "Victoria's always practical," my father said approvingly. "No need for flashy things." Isabel, still floating on her BMW cloud, added, "You can use your Christmas bonus for something fun if you want, Vic. I'm sure Dad made sure you got something nice this year." The presumption in her tone made it clear she had no idea that I'd used my last 3 Christmas bonuses to quietly invest in the market downturns I'd correctly predicted, growing my portfolio to a respectable 6 figures that nobody in my family knew about. They assumed I simply saved everything because that fit their image of practical, sensible Victoria. As the evening continued, I sat through dessert and coffee with the same pleasant mask I'd perfected over decades of family gatherings. I congratulated Isabel, admired the car when it was my turn, and deflected questions about my boring investment work with self-deprecating comments that reinforced my family's perception of me. Only Grandpa Maxwell seemed to notice something was off. As I prepared to leave, he pulled me aside, his frail hand surprisingly strong on my arm. "Remember what I taught you," he said quietly. "True value isn't in what you receive, but in what you build." I kissed his papery cheek, wondering if he realized how prophetic his words might prove to be. "I remember everything you taught me, Grandpa." Driving home in my sensible 4-year-old Audi, purchased used but in excellent condition, after careful research, I felt something crystallizing inside me. The Sox versus BMW disparity wasn't simply about the monetary value. It was the perfect physical manifestation of how differently I was valued within my own family. For years, I'd told myself that recognition didn't matter, that I took pride in my work regardless of acknowledgement. But as I parked in front of my building, I admitted to myself what I'd long denied. Being perpetually overlooked hurt. More importantly, it was affecting my professional future. As long as I remained invisible within Donovan Financial, I would never have the opportunity to lead, despite being the most qualified person in the firm. Something needed to change. I just didn't realize how soon the opportunity would present itself. The week between Christmas and New Year's always brought a strange lull to Donovan Financial Group. Most clients were occupied with holiday celebrations, and even my workaholic father typically reduced his hours, spending time at his country club or taking my mother on short winter getaways. This year, however, the office remained unusually busy. I arrived each morning before 7 to find the lights already on in my father's corner office, and left each evening well after dark with his door still closed, voices murmuring behind it. Something significant was happening, but as usual, I wasn't included in whatever discussions were taking place. Despite being the firm's chief investment officer, a title that would have carried actual authority in any company except a family business, I remained outside the inner circle of decision-making. On Thursday morning, I was reviewing quarterly projections when my father's assistant, Margaret, knocked on my doorframe. "Victoria? Your father would like to see you in the conference room at 11. I glanced up from my spreadsheets. "What's it regarding?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's expression remained professionally neutral, though I detected a flicker of something, sympathy perhaps, in her eyes. "He didn't specify, just asked me to tell you it's important." After she left, I checked my calendar, noting that 11 o'clock had previously been blocked for my meeting with Westfield Technologies, our newest institutional client. I'd spent weeks preparing for this presentation, developing a comprehensive investment strategy for their employee pension fund. With growing unease, I called the Westfield CFO's office to confirm our meeting, only to be told by his assistant, "Oh, Mr. Donovan rescheduled for tomorrow. He said you had an internal matter to address today." My father had rescheduled my meeting without informing me. Again. At precisely 11, I entered the main conference room to find not just my father, but my mother, Isabel, and Gregory Pearson, the firm's longtime legal counsel and my father's golf partner. The atmosphere felt oddly formal, with everyone seated around the polished mahogany table as if for a board meeting rather than a family discussion. "Victoria, thank you for joining us," my father began with unusual formality. "Please take a seat." I chose the chair opposite Isabel, who was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. Whatever this meeting was about, it clearly pleased her. "As you know," my father continued, folding his hands on the table, "I turned 65 last month. While I have no immediate plans to fully retire, I've been considering the future leadership of Donovan Financial." My pulse quickened. Was this finally it? After years of handling increasingly complex portfolios, streamlining operations, and essentially running the day-to-day business while my father focused on client relationships, was he finally recognizing my contributions? "Succession planning is critical for any family business," he continued, "especially one that manages over $2 billion in client assets. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression despite the hope building within me. Perhaps the Christmas gift disparity had been unfortunate timing, my parents knowing that this much more significant acknowledgement was coming. After careful consideration and multiple discussions with our advisory board, my father said, his gaze briefly shifting toward Gregory, I've decided that effective immediately, Isabel will be named President and Chief Operating Officer of Donovan Financial Group, with the intention that she will assume the CEO position upon my retirement. The room seemed to tilt slightly as his words registered. Isabel, who spent more time on Instagram than investment research, who couldn't explain the difference between asset allocation and asset location, who had never once stayed late, to ensure a client's needs were met, was being handed leadership of the company I had helped build. Isabel has demonstrated exceptional vision and relationship-building skills, my father continued, seemingly oblivious to how each word landed like a physical blow. Her modern approach to client engagement represents the future direction we need to pursue. My mother reached across the table to squeeze Isabel's hand. We're so proud of you, darling. Gregory nodded approvingly. The board agrees this is the right decision for the firm's future. The board, which consisted of my father, Gregory, and two of my father's college fraternity brothers who had never worked a day in finance. That board. Victoria, my father, finally addressed me directly. You'll continue as Chief Investment Officer, of course. Your analytical skills are invaluable to the firm. Analytical skills, not leadership, not vision, just numbers, processed efficiently and without fuss by reliable Victoria. I see, I managed, though my throat felt uncomfortably tight. And what exactly will Isabel's responsibilities entail as president? My father frowned slightly at my direct question. She'll oversee strategic direction, client relationship management, and ultimately, all operational aspects of the business. Working closely with me, of course. Of course, I echoed. And her qualifications for this role include? Victoria, my mother interjected, her tone carrying that familiar warning that I was being difficult. It's a fair question, I persisted, looking directly at Isabel. What experience do you have in operations management, portfolio construction, regulatory compliance, staff supervision? Isabel's triumphant smile faltered slightly. I bring a fresh perspective, Victoria. Not everyone needs to be buried in spreadsheets to add value. Exactly, my father nodded. The firm needs innovation, not just continuation of existing processes. Isabel has demonstrated creative thinking with her marketing initiatives. The Instagram posts featuring elaborately staged photos of empty conference rooms with inspirational quotes about wealth. The client appreciation events that consistently went over budget. The branded merchandise that sat unused in storage room boxes. I've developed operational improvements that increased our profit margin by 22% over the past 3 years, I said quietly. I've expanded our institutional client base from 2 accounts to 15. I've implemented portfolio strategies that outperformed benchmarks by an average of 4% annually. My father waved his hand dismissively. Yes, your technical contributions are appreciated. But leadership requires more than just technical expertise. It requires vision. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Victoria doesn't have vision. Victoria executes what others envision. I understand, I said, gathering my portfolio and standing up. If there's nothing else, I should prepare for tomorrow's Westfield meeting, the one that was rescheduled without my knowledge. My father had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Yes, well, we needed this time slot. Gregory has another commitment this afternoon. Gregory, evidently recognizing the tension, cleared his throat. Victoria, your investment strategies have been exemplary. The board specifically noted your technical contributions in their decision documentation. His attempt at reassurance only twisted the knife further. Technical contributions. as if I were a specialized calculator rather than a financial professional with a master's degree in economics and a decade of experience. "Thank you for clarifying the new structure," I said, addressing no one in particular. "I'll adjust my workflow accordingly." As I reached the door, Isabel called after me. "We should have dinner soon to discuss how we'll work together going forward. I have lots of ideas for the investment department." The investment department, my department, which she now presumed to direct despite having no relevant qualifications. "I'll check my calendar," I replied without turning around. Back in my office, I closed the door and sat motionless at my desk, staring at the framed certificates on the wall, my MBA from Wharton, my CFA designation, various industry recognitions that apparently counted for nothing compared to my sister's fresh perspective. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Margaret entered with a cup of tea, prepared exactly how I liked it, with just a touch of honey and no milk. "Heard about the announcement," she said simply, placing the tea on my desk. "For what it's worth, everyone knows who really runs this place." I managed a small smile. "Apparently everyone except my father." Margaret, who had been with the firm since before I was born, gave me a long, measured look. "Your grandfather built this company through smart decisions, not sentiment. He'd have chosen differently." After she left, I sipped the tea and considered my options. I could resign immediately, leveraging my experience and proven track record to secure a position at one of Boston's many investment firms. I could confront my father more directly, laying out the objective case for my leadership over Isabel's. I could even choose acceptance, continuing in my role while reporting to my less qualified younger sister. None of these options felt right. My phone chimed with a text from my grandfather. "Heard the news, need to speak with you. Come for lunch tomorrow?" I responded with a simple yes, and returned to the Westfield presentation, mechanically reviewing slides I could have recited from memory. The firm needed this account, a $50 million pension portfolio that would generate substantial management fees. I would deliver an impeccable presentation tomorrow, not for my father or Isabel's benefit, but because the 68 Westfield employees depending on those pension funds deserved nothing less than my best work. That evening, as I drove home, through light snow, I reflected on the pattern that had defined my life within the Donovan family. The BMW versus Sox disparity wasn't an anomaly. It was simply the most recent and tangible manifestation of a lifetime of disparate treatment. When we were children, Isabel received cheerleading camp while I attended math enrichment programs. In high school, my parents attended every one of Isabel's chorus performances, but made it to only one of my debate team championships. At college graduation, they praised Isabel's B- average as balanced achievement, while my summa cum laude honors were treated as expected rather than exceptional. I had accepted this imbalance for decades, telling myself that results mattered more than recognition. But today's meeting had made one thing painfully clear: recognition translated directly to opportunity. Without it, my professional growth would remain permanently capped, my contributions perpetually undervalued. As I parked outside my building, I made a decision. Tomorrow, after the Westfield presentation and lunch with my grandfather, I would begin developing a concrete plan. Not just an emotional reaction, but a strategic response to decades of systematic undervaluation. Something needed to change, and for once, I would be the one controlling that change rather than adapting to decisions made by others. The Westfield Technologies presentation went flawlessly. I delivered a comprehensive investment strategy that balanced growth opportunities with risk management appropriate for a pension portfolio. The CFO and his team asked insightful questions, which I answered with confidence and specificity, drawing on my deep knowledge of both market dynamics and their company's particular needs. By the end of the meeting, they had committed their full portfolio to Donovan Financial, a significant win that would generate approximately $375,000 in annual management fees. As the Westfield executives filed out, my father stepped forward to shake hands and exchange pleasantries, smoothly taking credit for the strategy I had developed. "We're delighted to welcome Westfield to the Donovan family," he said warmly. "Victoria's team has prepared an excellent framework under my guidance." My team consisted of exactly 2 junior analysts who had indeed provided valuable support, but the core strategy, the intellectual architecture that had won the account, had been entirely my creation. Not that anyone would know this from my father's characterization. "Actually," the Westfield CFO said, turning toward me, "Ms. Donovan's approach to integrating environmental and social governance factors while maintaining yield targets was the deciding factor for us. Very innovative work." I watched my father's expression shift almost imperceptibly. He hadn't even reviewed my presentation beforehand, having complete confidence that I would deliver something competent but presumably not innovative. "Victoria has always had a solid grasp of technical details," he acknowledged with a tight smile. "We encourage all our team members to bring forward their best ideas." After seeing the Westfield team out, I gathered my materials without speaking. 8 years of delivering exceptional work, and still my father couldn't acknowledge my contributions without qualification or diminishment. "Good job in there," he said as I prepared to leave. "Though next time, perhaps emphasize our firm's long-term track record more prominently. Clients find our history reassuring." Our history. The narrative my father had constructed in which his leadership was the primary factor in the firm's success, rather than the collective contributions of dozens of financial professionals, many of whom had left over the years, frustrated by the lack of recognition and advancement opportunities in a family-dominated business. "I emphasized what the client valued," I replied evenly. "Their priority is forward-looking strategy, not historical performance." My father frowned. "I've been in this business for 40 years, Victoria. I know what clients respond to." "The $50 million they just committed would suggest they responded well to my approach," I said, unable to keep a slight edge from my voice. He blinked, seemingly surprised by my directness. "Well, yes. Good work, as I said." "Will you be joining us for the celebration dinner tonight? Your mother's making reservations at Maison Laurent." "I have plans with Grandpa," I replied, knowing they had arranged this dinner without consulting my schedule, exactly as they had scheduled yesterday's announcement without consideration for my previously arranged meeting. My father nodded absently, already scrolling through messages on his phone. "Another time, then. Isabel will want to discuss her ideas for client retention. Strategies with you soon. She has some exciting concepts." "I'm sure she does," I thought, but merely nodded before leaving. The familiar sting of exclusion, being good enough to do the work but not important enough to include in the celebration of its success, had become so routine I barely registered it anymore. 40 minutes later, I was seated across from my grandfather at Vittorio's, the small Italian restaurant he had frequented for decades. Despite his wealth, Maxwell Donovan preferred simple pleasures: homemade pasta, conversations with longtime waitstaff who knew him by name, and the unpretentious atmosphere that reminded him of his modest beginnings. "You landed Westfield," he stated rather than asked, eyes twinkling with pride. "Margaret called me." "I did," I confirmed, allowing myself a small smile of satisfaction. "Their full pension portfolio. Impressive. Their CFO has a reputation for thoroughness." He settled back as the waiter delivered his usual glass of Chianti. "Now, about yesterday's announcement." I took a sip of water, gathering my thoughts. It was unexpected. "It was foolish," my grandfather said bluntly. "Richard has always had a blind spot where Isabel is concerned." The directness of his assessment startled me. My grandfather rarely criticized his son's decisions openly, at least not to me. "She has certain capabilities," I offered diplomatically. "She has charm and confidence, both valuable qualities. he agreed. But running an investment firm requires substance. Beneath the style. The waiter returned with bread and departed discreetly, sensing our serious conversation. Dad believes she brings a fresh perspective, I said, repeating my father's justification without inflection. My grandfather snorted. Fresh perspective. As if financial fundamentals have changed since my day. Markets evolve, technologies advance, but core principles remain constant. Integrity, disciplined analysis, and putting client interests first. He leaned forward. Principles you embody far more than your sister. His validation, normally so gratifying, now carried a bitter edge. If he recognized my capabilities so clearly, why hadn't he intervened in my father's decision? As if reading my thoughts, he continued. I've made many mistakes, Victoria. One of my greatest was stepping back too completely when Richard took over. I wanted to give him room to lead without his old man looking over his shoulder, but in giving him that freedom, I may have allowed certain tendencies to go unchecked. Tendencies? Richard has always valued presentation over substance. It's why he became the face of the firm while I managed operations and strategy behind the scenes. The arrangement worked because we balanced each other. But without counterbalance? He shrugged expressively. So, what am I supposed to do? I asked, frustration finally surfacing. Continue being the substance behind Isabel's style? Watch her take credit for my work just as Dad has for years? Be grateful for wool socks while she gets BMWs? My grandfather's eyebrows rose slightly at the last comment, but he didn't ask for elaboration. You have more options than you realize, he said instead, reaching for his worn leather briefcase beside the chair. He withdrew a manila folder and placed it on the table between us. I had Gregory prepare these last month when Richard first started discussing succession plans with the board. I opened the folder to find legal documents, corporate structures, ownership percentages, voting rights agreements. Scanning the contents, I gradually realized what I was seeing. You transferred your shares to me? I asked, disbelief coloring. My voice. My grandfather held a 30% ownership stake in Donovan Financial. My father controlled 51%, with the remaining 19% distributed among various minor shareholders including Isabel, who had received a 5% gift on her 30th birthday. I had always assumed Grandpa's shares would transfer to my father upon his death, consolidating Richard's control further. Not all of them, my grandfather clarified. I've transferred 25% to you, effective last week. I've retained 5% and a board seat for now. The implications dawned slowly. With 25% ownership, I would become the second largest shareholder in the firm, not enough to outvote my father, but enough to block certain major decisions that required supermajority approval under the corporate bylaws. Why? I managed, still processing this unexpected development. Because you've earned it, he said simply, and because the firm needs your influence if it's going to survive another generation. He tapped the document with one gnarled finger. Page 4 outlines your rights as a significant minority shareholder. Page 7 details decisions requiring more than simple majority approval. I flipped to the indicated pages, scanning quickly. Major asset sales, compensation structures for executives, dividend distributions, strategic partnerships, all required 75% shareholder approval. Does Dad know about this? I asked, already anticipating the explosion that would follow. Not yet. Gregory will inform him officially on Monday. My grandfather's expression remained serene. I imagine he'll be displeased. This was a monumental understatement. Richard Donovan had operated for decades with absolute authority, making unilateral decisions about every aspect of the business. The idea that he would now need my approval for significant changes was unthinkable. This will change everything, I said quietly. That's rather the point, my grandfather replied. The question is, what will you do with this influence? Simply block Richard's worst impulses or push for something more substantive? The question hung between us as our lunch arrived. My grandfather began eating his linguine with clams as if he hadn't just fundamentally altered the power dynamics of our family business. Meanwhile, my mind raced with possibilities that had been unimaginable just hours earlier. With significant ownership came not just blocking power, but legitimate authority, the ability to demand information, question decisions, and advocate for alternative approaches. I could ensure my department received appropriate resources, prevent Isabel from implementing her most impractical ideas, and potentially even influence future leadership decisions. But even as these tactical advantages became clear, a deeper question emerged. Did I want to fight for influence within a system that had consistently undervalued me? Or was it time to consider more radical alternatives? "There's something else you should know," my grandfather said, interrupting my thoughts. Page 12 contains provisions regarding shareholder liquidity rights. I turned to the indicated section, reading carefully. If a qualified offer was made for any shareholder's stake, other shareholders had first right of refusal at the offered price. If they declined to purchase, the shareholder could sell to the offering party. "Are you suggesting I should sell my shares?" I asked, confused by this direction. "I'm ensuring you have options," he corrected. "Options Richard never gave you. Your shares would be worth approximately $15 million at current valuation." The figure momentarily took my breath away. While I had always known the firm was valuable, seeing my potential stake quantified so concretely was jarring. "I don't want you trapped, Victoria," my grandfather continued. "Whether you stay and fight for the vision you believe in, or take your expertise elsewhere, the choice should be yours. Not Richard's, not Isabel's, and not even mine." For the first time since yesterday's devastating announcement, I felt something beyond anger and hurt. I felt possibility. Real, tangible possibility. "Thank you," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "for believing in me when no one else has." He reached across the table to cover my hand with his. "I've always seen you clearly, Victoria. Now it's time for you to be seen by everyone else, whether they're ready for it or not." Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The weekend had given me time to process my grandfather's unexpected gift and strategize my next steps. I'd spent hours reviewing the legal documents, researching corporate governance structures, and evaluating my options with a methodical precision that had always been my strength. As I dressed for work, I selected a charcoal gray suit I typically reserved for client presentations, structured, impeccably tailored, and subtly powerful. Today wouldn't involve client meetings, but it would require every ounce of authority I could project. I arrived at the office 30 minutes earlier than usual, wanting to establish myself before the inevitable confrontation. Margaret was already at her desk, organizing the day's files with her characteristic efficiency. "Your father has called an emergency executive meeting at 9, she informed me, her expression revealing nothing. "Conference room A." "I assumed he might," I replied calmly. "Gregory delivered the shareholder documents this morning?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face before her professional mask returned. 8 a.m. sharp. I've never seen Mr. Donovan quite so animated." "I imagine not." I gathered the quarterly performance reports I'd prepared over the weekend. "Could you make sure the presentation system in Conference Room A is working properly? I'll need to display some data." Margaret nodded, her eyes communicating a silent message of support. In a firm where family dynamics overshadowed merit, career employees like Margaret had witnessed decades of inequity without comment. Their silent solidarity had often been my only acknowledgement. At precisely 9 o'clock, I entered the conference room to find my father pacing at the head of the table, face flushed with anger. Isabel sat nearby, her expression vacillating, between confusion and indignation. Gregory occupied his usual position, his lawyer's composure firmly in place despite the tension. Two other executives, our head of operations and chief compliance officer, sat awkwardly, clearly uncertain why they'd been summoned. "Victoria," my father said tersely. "Sit down. We need to discuss this situation." I took my time arranging my materials before responding. "Good morning, everyone. I assume we're here to discuss the revised shareholder structure." "Revised?" Isabel interjected. "Dad, what's happening?" My father's jaw tightened. "It seems your grandfather has decided to interfere with our succession plans. He's transferred 25% of company shares to Victoria." The other executives exchanged glances, processing the implications. In a privately held firm like ours, ownership equaled power in ways that titles alone did not. "Not interference," I corrected calmly. "Strategic investment in qualified leadership." My father slammed his hand on the table. "This is completely unacceptable. Maxwell had no right to disrupt the leadership structure we established last week." "Actually," Gregory interjected with professional detachment, "Mr. Donovan retained full rights to dispose of his shares as he saw fit. The transfer is legally binding and properly executed. This is a family matter that should have been discussed privately," my father insisted. "Like the decision to make Isabel president without consulting the second most senior executive in the firm?" I asked, my tone deliberately mild despite the directness of the question. The other executives studied their notepads, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before them. "That was a business decision based on strategic needs," my father replied stiffly. "Exactly," I agreed. "And this is a business discussion about strategic direction, which is why I've prepared an analysis of our current position and recommendations for moving forward." Without waiting for permission, I activated the presentation screen, displaying a comprehensive breakdown of the firm's performance metrics, client acquisition costs, retention rates, and departmental contributions to revenue. "Over the past 5 years," I began, "our institutional client division has grown by 340%, now representing 42% of total firm revenue. Operational efficiency has improved by 22% through systems I personally implemented. Our investment performance has exceeded benchmarks by an average of 3.2% annually, placing us in the top quartile of wealth management firms in our category." I advanced to the next slide, which contrasted these results with the marketing division's metrics under Isabel's leadership. Meanwhile, client acquisition costs have increased by 35%, while new client numbers have remained flat. Social media engagement has grown, but with no corresponding increase in qualified leads. Marketing expenditures have exceeded budgeted allocations by an average of 28% annually for 3 consecutive years. Isabel's face flushed. "Those investments are building our brand for long-term growth. You can't measure everything in immediate returns." "Actually, we can and should," I replied evenly. "ROI isn't just a convenient acronym. It's the fundamental measure of business effectiveness. Every dollar we spend should generate measurable value, whether immediately or through carefully tracked progress toward strategic objectives." I advanced to the next slide, which outlined my proposed restructuring plan. "As a significant shareholder, I'm proposing the following changes to maximize firm value and ensure sustainable growth. First, implementation of a merit-based executive compensation structure tied directly to measurable performance metrics. Second, reallocation of marketing resources toward data-driven initiatives with clear ROI tracking. Third, expansion of our institutional services division, which has demonstrated superior growth and profitability." My father's expression darkened with each point. "You've prepared quite a presentation for someone who just learned about her shareholding status this weekend." "I've had these analyses ready for years," I replied honestly. "The only difference is that now I have the authority to ensure they receive proper consideration." The truth of this statement hung in the air. How many reports had I submitted that were never read? How many improvement proposals had disappeared into my father's inbox without response? How many times had I identified problems and solutions, only to be patted on the head for being thorough while no actual changes were implemented? "This is ridiculous," Isabel declared, standing up. "Dad made me president of this company. You can't just come in with some charts and statistics and undermine his decision." "I'm not undermining anything," I corrected. "I'm exercising my rights as a major shareholder to ensure the firm operates according to best practices rather than nepotism." "Nepotism!" my father exploded. "I've built this firm from what my father started into a regional powerhouse. Every decision I've made has been in the best interest of the business, including making your less qualified daughter president over your more qualified one," I asked quietly. The room fell silent. I had finally named the dynamic that had shaped our family business for decades, the careful dance around acknowledging that personal preference, rather than professional merit, guided my father's most important decisions. After a moment, my father adopted a more conciliatory tone. "Victoria, you've always been valued for your analytical contributions, but leadership requires different qualities than analysis. Isabel connects with people in ways that inspire confidence. Leadership requires both vision and substance," I countered. "Charisma without competence is a liability, not an asset, when managing $2 billion of other people's money." Gregory cleared his throat. "If I might suggest, perhaps we should adjourn to consider these developments more carefully. The new ownership structure does create certain governance implications that require thoughtful consideration." My father nodded stiffly, recognizing that his attorney was trying to prevent him from making statements he might regret. "Fine, we'll reconvene tomorrow. Victoria, I'd like to speak with you privately." "Actually," I replied, gathering my materials, "I have a client meeting in 15 minutes. I'd be happy to schedule time later this week for a detailed discussion of governance procedures under the new structure." Without waiting for his response, I left the conference room, heart pounding despite my outward composure. I had directly challenged my father's authority for the first time in my professional life. There would be consequences, but also possibilities I'd never had before. Throughout the day, I maintained my normal routine: client calls, portfolio, reviews, team management, while the office buzzed with whispers about the morning's confrontation. By late afternoon, Margaret informed me that my father had left early, claiming a golf appointment, though the January weather made that unlikely. Just after 5, Isabel appeared in my doorway, her typical confidence noticeably diminished. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, saving my work before giving her my full attention. "That was humiliating," she began without preamble. "You made me look completely incompetent. In front of the executive team." "The data made you look incompetent," I corrected. "I simply presented facts." "Facts can be manipulated to tell any story," she countered. "You deliberately selected metrics that favored your departments over mine." "I selected standard industry metrics applied consistently across all divisions. Your department underperformed against objective benchmarks." Isabel's expression shifted from indignation to something I rarely saw from her: uncertainty. "Why didn't you ever say anything before about wanting to be president?" The question caught me off guard. "Would it have mattered if I had?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I just always assumed you were happy with your role. You never seemed to want the spotlight." This was Isabel's particular talent: reframing systemic unfairness as personal preference, transforming others' subordination into their own choice rather than her privilege. "Not wanting unnecessary attention isn't the same as not wanting appropriate recognition," I explained carefully. "I've dedicated my career to this. Firm's success while watching you receive disproportionate rewards for minimal contribution." The BMW versus socks dynamic has played out in 100 different ways throughout our lives. The BMW? She looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? Christmas, I reminded her. You received a $65,000 luxury vehicle. I received $12 worth of wool socks. Understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by defensive justification. That was Mom and Dad's decision, not mine. And they've always given you financial things, stocks and bonds and whatever, while I get material gifts. You're comparing a single gift without the full context. This rationalization was so absurd, I almost laughed. Isabel, I've never received investment gifts from our parents. Not once. I built my portfolio through my own earnings and decisions. Her certainty faltered. But they always said they were investing in your future differently than mine. That you were the financial one, so they supported that. For a moment, I glimpsed something unexpected. My sister genuinely believed. A narrative our parents had constructed to justify their disparate treatment. The realization didn't excuse her willing participation in an unfair system, but it suggested she might not fully understand the extent of the imbalance. Our parents have consistently favored you over me in every measurable way, I said bluntly. That's their prerogative as parents. But in a business context, merit and results should matter more than personal preference. Isabel sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this perspective. So what happens now? You force Dad to make you president instead of me? Now I ensure this company operates according to professional standards rather than familial politics, I replied. Whether that includes leadership changes depends on multiple factors, including your willingness to develop genuine competence in the role you've been given. And if I don't want to serve under these new conditions? Then you have choices to make, just as I do. I leaned forward slightly. For the first time, Isabel, neither of us is simply subject to Dad's decisions. We both have agency in determining what happens next. As my sister left, looking more thoughtful than I could remember seeing her, I realized we had just had perhaps our first honest adult conversation. Whether it would lead to meaningful change remained to be seen, but at least, pretense had been temporarily set aside. My phone chimed with a text from my grandfather. Heard about this morning. Well handled? Dinner tonight? I smiled slightly at his succinct message. Thank you. Yes to dinner. The usual place at 7? His reply came quickly. Perfect. Bring your appetite and that strategic mind of yours. We have planning to do. For the first time in years, I left the office exactly at closing time, feeling a weight lifting that I hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to ease. The confrontation I had avoided for so long had finally occurred, and while the outcome remained uncertain, I had discovered something valuable in the process. My own voice, clear and confident, speaking truths long suppressed. Whatever came, next would be shaped by my choices rather than my passive acceptance of others' decisions. That realization alone was worth more than any BMW or executive title could ever be. Vittorio's restaurant offered a welcome contrast to the day's intensity. Soft lighting, quiet conversations, and the comforting aromas of Italian cooking created an atmosphere where strategic thinking could flourish without the emotionally charged dynamics of the office. My grandfather had secured his usual corner table, a glass of Chianti already waiting alongside his water. You've caused quite a stir, he observed as I settled across from him, his eyes twinkling with something between amusement and pride. Word travels fast, I remarked, accepting the menu from the waiter, though I already knew I would order the penne arrabbiata, comfort food with a kick, precisely what the situation called for. Margaret called me twice, he confirmed. Once. After the morning meeting, once after your conversation with Isabel. She's worked for the family long enough to recognize significant shifts when they occur. After placing our orders, I recounted the day's events in detail, describing not just what had been said, but the subtle power dynamics at play. My grandfather listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. His decades of business experience allowing him to grasp implications I was still processing. "Your father called me as well," he added when I finished. "Quite upset about my interference in established succession plans," as he phrased it. I imagine that was an uncomfortable conversation. My grandfather's expression turned contemplative. "Richard has always believed his decisions are beyond question. It's a perspective I inadvertently encouraged by giving him too much autonomy too quickly. Today was perhaps the first time in 30 years he's been genuinely challenged." "He won't accept this easily," I observed, thanking the waiter as he delivered our meals. "The question is what form his resistance will take." "Indeed." My grandfather twirled pasta thoughtfully. "He's likely consulting with Gregory about options for diluting your influence or circumventing the supermajority requirements. Legal maneuvers are Richard's preferred approach to obstacles." I considered this assessment while beginning my own meal. Gregory seemed notably neutral this morning. Professional, but not obviously aligned with either position. "Gregory is an attorney first, family friend second. He'll present Richard with all available options, but he won't support anything that creates legitimate legal exposure." He took a sip of wine. "That said, we should prepare for several possibilities." What followed was a masterclass in strategic thinking. My grandfather methodically outlined potential scenarios, counter-strategies, and contingency plans. His mind remained razor-sharp at 84, capable of anticipating moves and counter-moves with the precision of a chess grandmaster. We discussed everything from board composition to client retention strategies, from regulatory considerations to media management should internal conflicts become public. "You've thought this through extensively," I noted, impressed by his preparation. "I've had years to consider the firm's future," he replied, "watching Richard's leadership style calcify, observing your capabilities develop while your opportunities remained artificially constrained. The only question was timing." "Why now?" I asked, the question that had lingered since his revelation at our previous lunch. "Why not years ago, or after your eventual passing through inheritance?" My grandfather set down his utensils, his expression turning serious. "Two reasons. First, waiting until my death would have placed an unfair burden on you, forcing a confrontation during a time of grief without my guidance. Second, and more importantly, I needed to be certain." "Certain of what?" "That you truly wanted leadership, not just recognition. That you had developed not just technical excellence but strategic vision. That you would use influence for the firm's benefit, not merely to correct personal injustice." His gaze held mine steadily. "I had to be sure you were ready not just professionally, but psychologically." "And the BMW versus Sox Christmas demonstrated that psychological readiness?" I asked, a hint of skepticism in my tone. "It demonstrated your breaking point," he corrected. "Every person has one. That moment when accommodation of unfairness becomes more painful than confrontation of it. I've watched you absorb countless inequities with grace and professionalism. The Christmas display was merely the culmination that crystallized your awareness of a pattern you'd tolerated too long." His assessment was uncomfortably accurate. The absurd gift disparity had indeed functioned as a catalyst, transforming years of accumulated resentment into clarity about systemic unfairness. "The question now," my grandfather continued, "is what you truly want moving forward. Your 25% stake gives you significant influence but not control. You could use it defensively, blocking Richard's worst decisions. You could negotiate for the presidency, leveraging your position for the role you deserve. You could even sell your shares and establish your own firm, free from family complications. What would you advise?" I asked, valuing his perspective despite knowing the decision must ultimately be mine. "I would advise you to think beyond reaction to creation," he replied. Most people in your position would focus on what they don't want. Continuation of unfair treatment, inappropriate leadership, diminished opportunity. The more powerful question is what you affirmatively want to build, both for yourself and for the clients who depend on our stewardship. This reframing shifted something fundamental in my thinking. I had indeed been focused primarily on preventing further injustice rather than creating something new, defense rather than vision. The firm needs significant restructuring, I said, thinking aloud. The current leadership model concentrates too much authority in a single role, creating vulnerability to individual bias and blind spots. A more distributed model with clear accountability measures would better serve both employees and clients. My grandfather nodded encouragingly. Continue. Our service model needs evolution as well. The wealth management industry is changing rapidly, with technology enabling more personalized approaches at scale. We've underinvested in these capabilities while overinvesting in traditional marketing that yields diminishing returns. As I outlined additional observations about organizational structure, talent development, and strategic positioning, my grandfather listened with growing approval. "This is precisely why I transferred those shares to you," he said when I finished. "You see not just what is, but what could be. Richard sees the firm as a finished creation to be preserved. You see it as a living entity that must evolve." Evolution doesn't guarantee I'll have the authority to implement these changes, I pointed out, even with 25% ownership. True, he acknowledged, which brings us to the next phase of strategic planning. Tomorrow morning, your father will likely propose some form of compromise designed to limit the practical impact of your new ownership position. Your response to this initial offer will set the tone for all that follows. He reached into his briefcase, extracting a slim folder. "I've prepared some suggested approaches based on my experience with Richard's negotiation patterns. Review them tonight, but remember, your strongest position comes from absolute clarity about your non-negotiable priorities." As we finished our meal, the conversation shifted to implementation details, communication strategies, key stakeholder management, and timeline considerations. My grandfather's guidance was invaluable, but I noticed something subtle changing in his approach. Where he had once provided direct answers, he now increasingly asked questions that led me toward my own conclusions. He was transitioning from instructor to advisor, acknowledging my capacity to chart my own course. When we parted outside the restaurant, he clasped my shoulder in a rare physical gesture of support. "Victoria, remember something important. This situation involves business strategies and legal positions, but at its core, it's about something more fundamental, standing in your full value without apology or diminishment." "That's not always comfortable," I admitted. "Comfort is overrated," he replied with a small smile. "Growth rarely occurs within comfort zones. But I've watched you operate in discomfort for years, doing excellent work without recognition, contributing without appropriate reward. The difference now is that the discomfort serves your advancement rather than others' convenience." His words resonated deeply. How many times had I suppressed my own needs to maintain family harmony? How often had I accepted less than I deserved to avoid conflict? The discomfort of confrontation wasn't new. What was new was directing that discomfort toward purposeful change rather than passive accommodation. During the drive home, I considered the multiple pathways forward. Each option, negotiating for leadership, creating a new power-sharing structure, or potentially even departing to establish my own firm, carried both advantages and challenges. The critical difference was that for the first time, I would be choosing from options rather than accepting imposed circumstances. At home, I changed into comfortable clothes and settled at my desk with the materials my grandfather had provided. His suggested approaches were characteristically thorough, anticipating various scenarios with corresponding strategies. As I reviewed them, I began drafting my own framework, incorporating his wisdom while shaping responses that reflected my specific priorities and communication style. Around midnight, I took a break, making tea and standing by my living room window to observe the city lights. The vista had always brought me peace, the ordered patterns of illumination against darkness, the sense of human activity even in night's quietude. Tonight, it offered something additional: perspective. From this distance, individual buildings blended into a coherent whole, much as individual decisions accumulated to create a life's direction. For years, I had made small accommodations, each seemingly insignificant in isolation, but collectively defining a pattern of undervaluation. Now, I stood at a juncture where different choices could establish an entirely new trajectory. My phone chimed with a text from Isabel. "I've been thinking about our conversation. Maybe we should talk more before tomorrow's meeting. Breakfast?" This unexpected outreach suggested my sister might be more adaptable than I'd assumed. Perhaps she too recognized that our father's binary approach to our capabilities had constrained both our potential in different ways. 7:30 at Carlyle's Cafe? I replied, naming a quiet spot near the office. "See you there," came her immediate response. Returning to my desk, I completed my strategic framework with renewed clarity. Whatever emerged from tomorrow's discussions, I would approach them from a position of defined purpose, rather than reactive emotion. The turning point wasn't just in circumstances, but in mindset. From accommodation to advocacy, from acceptance to intentional creation. As I finally prepared for sleep, I noticed something I'd overlooked earlier: a small box that had arrived in that day's mail. Opening it, I found a handwritten note from my grandfather, accompanied by a vintage fountain pen I recognized as having belonged to my grandmother, a successful journalist in an era when female reporters were rarities. The note read simply, "Margaret. Reminded me that Elizabeth used this pen to sign her first syndicated column contract. Seemed appropriate for another woman preparing to sign documents that will reshape her future. Some instruments carry more than ink. They carry intention." The gift's symbolism wasn't lost on me. My grandmother had faced institutional barriers, far greater than mine, yet had created an award-winning career through persistence and undeniable excellence. The pen represented not just a family heirloom, but a lineage of determination that transcended individual circumstances. I placed it carefully on my nightstand, a tangible reminder that tomorrow would not merely be a business negotiation, but a declaration of value, my own and that of every person whose contributions had been systematically minimized by structures designed to maintain established power rather than recognize emerging capability. The turning point had arrived, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a convergence of awareness, opportunity, and readiness. Whatever specific outcomes emerged, the fundamental shift had already occurred within me. I would no longer participate in my own diminishment. With that certainty came a surprising sense of peace, allowing me to sleep more soundly than I had in months, perhaps years. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but for the first time, I would meet them as an active architect of circumstances rather than their passive recipient. Carlyle's Cafe occupied the ground floor of a renovated brownstone 2 blocks from our office. Its subdued elegance and discreet seating arrangements made it popular among financial professionals conducting sensitive discussions away from corporate environments. At 7:25, I secured a corner table partially screened by decorative lattice, providing both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. I ordered black coffee and reviewed my notes while waiting, surprised when Isabel arrived 5 minutes early. Punctuality had never been her strong suit, a trait our father indulged while holding others to precise timeliness. She appeared unusually subdued, her typically flawless presentation slightly muted as if she'd deliberated over appearing too polished for this conversation. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, settling across from me and ordering a cappuccino when the server approached. "I didn't sleep much last night." That makes two of us, I acknowledged, setting aside my notes to give her my full attention. Isabel fidgeted with her napkin, uncharacteristically hesitant. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about merit and recognition and patterns I might not have noticed. I waited, allowing her the space to continue without interruption. After our conversation, I called Mom, she admitted. I asked about the investment gifts they supposedly gave you over the years. And? She got flustered, started talking about different love languages and how they expressed appreciation differently for each of us. Isabel met my gaze directly. But she couldn't name a single specific investment they'd made for you. Not one. This confirmation of what I already knew brought surprisingly little satisfaction. I didn't tell you that to make you feel guilty, Isabel. Family dynamics are complex, and you weren't responsible for our parents' choices. Maybe not, she conceded, but I benefited from them while remaining conveniently oblivious. That's a kind of complicity, isn't it? Her self-awareness caught me off guard. Isabel had always excelled at self-justification, reframing situations to maintain her position at the center of positive narratives. This acknowledgement of potential complicity represented significant growth. What matters now is what we do moving forward, I offered. Isabel nodded, taking a sip of her cappuccino before continuing. I spent the night reviewing the quarterly reports you've submitted over the past 2 years. Reports I should have been reading all along as a department head, but usually just skimmed. And you were right about the marketing metrics. This admission clearly cost her considerable pride. We've been celebrating increased social media engagement while ignoring that it hasn't translated to client acquisition or retention. That's objectively poor performance. Her candor deserved reciprocation. Your social media strategy has successfully raised our profile among younger potential clients. That's not without value. The issue is aligning those efforts with measurable business outcomes. Isabel seemed to appreciate this balanced assessment. Dad's calling another executive meeting at 10. Before that happens, I need to understand something. What exactly do you want, Victoria? To take my position? To force Dad into early retirement? To sell your shares and leave altogether? The directness of her question demanded equal directness in response. What I want is for Donovan Financial to operate according to professional standards where contribution determines advancement, where strategy is based on data rather than preference, and where talented people, whether named Donovan or not, can thrive based on their actual capabilities. That sounds reasonable in theory, but in practice? In practice, it means significant changes to governance, compensation structures, and advancement pathways. I leaned forward slightly. Isabel, you have genuine talents, relationship building, creative thinking, institutional flexibility. But those talents don't automatically qualify you to run an entire financial services firm. Rather than the defensive reaction I expected, she nodded slowly. I know. I've always known, if I'm being honest. I just liked the recognition and didn't question whether I'd earned it. This level of self-reflection from my perpetually self-confident sister was unprecedented. Why the sudden introspection? Isabel seemed to consider her answer carefully. After our conversation yesterday, I called Jason Chen at Meridian Capital. We were at business school together, and his family firm is similar to ours in many ways. I knew of Meridian Capital, a respected wealth management firm that had successfully transitioned from first-generation founder to second-generation leadership team. Jason's father implemented a structured development program before any family member could assume executive leadership. Isabel continued. 3 years of progressive responsibility in different departments, regular performance evaluations by non-family executives, and successful completion of specific business improvement projects. That's a thoughtful approach, I acknowledged, intrigued by her research initiative. It is, she agreed. And none of it happened at Donovan Financial. Dad just decided I should be president because he's always found it easier to relate to me than to you. That's not a legitimate basis for a multi-million-dollar business decision. Her clarity on this point was startling. I had expected to negotiate with a defensive sister clinging to unearned privilege, not one openly acknowledging the flawed basis of her appointment. "So, what are you suggesting?" I asked cautiously. "A compromise that actually addresses the underlying issues rather than just reshuffling titles." She extracted a folder from her handbag and placed it between us. "I sketched this out last night. It's not perfect, but it might be a starting point." Opening the folder, I found a proposed organizational restructuring that differed significantly from our current model. Instead of a traditional president-CEO hierarchy, Isabel had outlined a leadership council comprising department heads with specific performance metrics and shared decision-making authority for major strategic initiatives. A distributed leadership model, I observed, impressed despite my lingering skepticism. With qualified department leaders who earn their positions through demonstrable results, not family connections, she added. Including a properly empowered chief investment officer position that would give you authority commensurate with your expertise. I studied the document more carefully, noting that she had included objective performance metrics for each leadership position, including her own proposed role as client relationship director, which played to her actual strengths rather than forcing her into a general management position she wasn't prepared for. "This is thoughtful," I acknowledged. "But why the dramatic shift in perspective? Yesterday you were devastated by my challenging your appointment." Isabel sighed, her usual polish momentarily replaced by genuine vulnerability. "Because once I started actually examining the situation objectively, I couldn't stop seeing the imbalances. Not just between us, but throughout the entire organization. People like Derek in compliance who've been passed over repeatedly despite excellent work. Talented advisors who've left because they saw no advancement path in a family-dominated structure." She gestured to the proposal. "This isn't completely selfless. I've included a role for myself that leverages what I'm genuinely good at. But it's a role I'd have to actually perform to measurable standards, not just occupy because of my last name." As our breakfast arrived, we continued discussing specifics of her proposal, identifying strengths to preserve and weaknesses to address before presenting anything formally. Throughout the conversation, I observed a side of Isabel I'd rarely seen: reflective, analytically engaged, and willing to question established patterns rather than simply benefiting from them. "Dad won't accept this easily," she noted as we prepared to leave. He genuinely believes his approach to leadership has been the primary factor in the firm's success. "The firm has succeeded despite his approach, not because of it," I replied. "Grandpa's fundamental investment philosophy and the work of dozens of talented professionals have generated our results. Dad's contribution has been client relationship management, which is valuable but not all-encompassing." Isabel nodded thoughtfully. "How do you suggest we approach this morning's meeting? United front, or let him present whatever he's planning first?" The question itself represented a remarkable shift. Isabel seeking strategic guidance rather than assuming her charm would carry the day. "Let him present first," I advised. "It gives us information about his thinking without revealing ours. After he outlines his position, we can introduce elements of this restructuring as a third way, beyond simply maintaining the status quo or engaging in protracted conflict." Outside the cafe, we paused before walking toward the office. "This doesn't erase years of imbalance," Isabel said quietly. "I know that." "No," I agreed, "but it's a meaningful step toward correction. Not many people willingly relinquish advantage once they recognize they possess it." "Maybe I'm finally growing up," she offered with a small smile. "Only took 32 years." The 10 o'clock meeting brought its own surprises. My father arrived with Gregory and 2 board members in tow, clearly intending to present a united front of established authority. His expression briefly registered, confusion at seeing Isabel and me engaged in quiet conversation rather than positioned as adversaries. "Before we begin," he announced once everyone was seated, "I want to emphasize that while recent developments have created certain complications, our primary responsibility remains to our clients and the firm's continued success." This framing was predictable, positioning any challenge to his authority as potentially threatening client interests rather than potentially enhancing them. "With that in mind," he continued, "I've consulted with our board and legal counsel to develop a resolution that addresses legitimate shareholder concerns while maintaining leadership stability." Gregory distributed documents outlining a proposal that would maintain the current executive structure while creating a separate oversight committee with limited review powers that would include me as a representative of minority shareholders. The arrangement would effectively isolate my influence while creating the appearance of inclusion, a sophisticated containment strategy rather than meaningful reform. I listened attentively, noting specific language choices that revealed his underlying assumptions: maintaining stability rather than enabling growth, preserving client relationships rather than enhancing client outcomes, continuing our successful approach rather than evolving to meet changing market conditions. When he finished, I thanked him for the proposal without commenting on its substance, then turned to Isabel with a questioning glance. Our breakfast discussion had prepared us for this moment, but the final decision to proceed remained hers. With a slight nod, she indicated her readiness. "I appreciate the thought that's gone into this proposal," Isabel began, surprising everyone by taking the lead. "However, after careful consideration of our current structure and future needs, I believe we should consider a more fundamental reassessment of our organizational model." She outlined the distributed leadership framework we had refined over breakfast, emphasizing performance-based advancement and cross-functional collaboration. As she spoke, I observed my father's expression shift from confusion to disbelief as he realized his daughter was not supporting his position. "This isn't what we discussed, Isabel," he interrupted, clearly rattled by this unexpected development. "I know," she acknowledged calmly. "Because after yesterday's meeting, I did something I should have done weeks ago. I actually reviewed our performance metrics across departments and recognized that our current approach isn't optimizing results." My father's gaze darted between us, finally grasping that Isabel and I had aligned our positions. "You two discussed this privately before the meeting." "We had breakfast," I confirmed, "as sisters and colleagues should when addressing shared business concerns." For the first time in my professional experience, I witnessed my father momentarily speechless, his carefully prepared strategy undermined not by my expected opposition, but by Isabel's unexpected alliance. Gregory, ever the pragmatist, broke the tension. "Perhaps we should take time to review both proposals in detail. This discussion would benefit from thoughtful consideration rather than immediate decisions." "Agreed," I said, leveraging the opening. "I suggest we schedule a formal review next Monday after everyone has had opportunity to examine both approaches thoroughly. In the meantime, Victoria and I can answer any specific questions about the distributed leadership model we've proposed." By using "we" and aligning myself with Isabel, I reinforced the united front while giving my father time to process this significant shift in dynamics. He would need that time. His entire leadership approach had been premised on maintaining control through divided loyalties among those beneath him. As the meeting adjourned, my father signaled for me to remain behind. When the room had emptied, he closed the door and turned to face me. "I don't know what you said to convince your sister to betray me," he began, anger barely contained beneath his professional veneer. "But this manipulation—" "Dad," I interrupted gently but firmly. "This isn't manipulation, it's growth, for both Isabel and the firm. She's recognized something fundamental that you haven't yet acknowledged. True capability matters more than comfortable familiarity." His expression hardened. "I've led this company successfully for 30 years. I think I understand what matters in business leadership. You've maintained what Grandpa built, I corrected. That's not the same as leading evolution for the next 30 years. As his face flushed with anger, I gathered my materials and moved toward the door. Review the proposal with an open mind, Dad. It includes a meaningful role for you that honors your strengths while acknowledging areas where others can now contribute more effectively. Leaving him to process this suggestion, I returned to my office to find a text from my grandfather. Heard about the breakfast summit. Strategic alignment with unexpected allies often creates the most powerful positions. Well played. His approval brought satisfaction, but more meaningful was the internal certainty that had crystallized through the morning's events. This wasn't simply about claiming recognition long denied or correcting personal injustice. It was about creating a professional environment where capability determined opportunity and contribution earned appropriate reward for everyone, not just for me. The path forward remained uncertain, with my father's resistance guaranteed and the details of any eventual restructuring still to be negotiated. But what had changed irrevocably was my relationship to that uncertainty. I was no longer merely responding to circumstances beyond my control, but actively shaping them through strategic alignment, clear communication, and unwavering focus on legitimate business needs rather than personal grievances. That evening, as I prepared for a dinner meeting with 2 key institutional clients, I found myself selecting my wardrobe with different criteria than usual. Rather than the understated attire I typically chose to avoid drawing attention, I opted for a confidently elegant suit in deep burgundy, professional but distinctive, appropriate for someone stepping fully into her authority rather than minimizing her presence. The BMW versus Sox Christmas seemed increasingly distant, not just in time, but in significance. It had functioned as a catalyst for change, but the transformation now underway transcended any single incident of inequity. What had begun as personal frustration had evolved into purposeful reconstruction of an organization's fundamental approach to leadership, recognition, and advancement. Sometimes the most powerful form of self-advocacy extends beyond individual circumstances to reshape the systems that enable disparate treatment in the first place. By pursuing structural change rather than merely personal advancement, I had discovered a form of leadership that aligned with my deepest values while creating opportunity for others facing similar barriers. The Sox, in retrospect, had been an unexpected gift after all, not for their practical function, but for their clarifying effect on patterns long tolerated but ultimately unsustainable. Sometimes, the smallest items carry the greatest weight when they represent the final increment that tips the scale from acceptance to action. The week following our strategic alliance unfolded with unexpected intensity. While my father maintained a public veneer of composure, behind the scenes he mobilized his longtime allies among board members and senior executives. My grandfather called it the quiet campaign, a flurry of private meetings, lengthy phone calls, and strategically timed golf outings where business decisions masqueraded as casual conversation. In response, Isabel and I established a daily strategy session in a small conference room we'd claimed as our planning headquarters. The space quickly transformed with whiteboards covered in organizational charts, implementation timelines, and communication strategies. What surprised me most wasn't the progress we made on the proposal, but the discovery of a sister I'd never truly known beneath the polished facade she'd presented for decades. I called Morgan in compliance yesterday, Isabel mentioned during Thursday's session. She showed me documentation of 3 regulatory recommendations she's made over the past 2 years that Dad dismissed without proper review. All 3 would have improved our risk position substantially. I looked up from the governance document I was annotating. Did she have alternatives? Comprehensive ones, with implementation plans Dad never even opened. Isabel shook her head, genuine frustration evident in her expression. I've spent years thinking our executives simply weren't very innovative, when in reality, they've been systematically silenced. This revelation reflected a pattern emerging throughout our discussions. Talented professionals whose contributions had been minimized or overlooked in service to my father's centralized authority. Each conversation revealed another layer of untapped potential within the organization we thought we knew. On Friday afternoon, Margaret delivered a sealed envelope from my grandfather. Inside was a handwritten note accompanying several pages of meticulous financial analysis. "Victoria," it read, "these projections demonstrate the revenue impact of implementing performance-based advancement across all departments. Most importantly, note the retention calculations on page 3. We're losing approximately $2 million annually in replacement costs and lost client relationships when talented people leave for organizations where their capabilities actually determine their trajectories. This isn't just about fairness, it's about financial sustainability." The analysis was precisely what we needed to strengthen the business case for our proposed restructuring. My grandfather's strategic mind remained razor-sharp, focusing not just on what was right, but on what was demonstrably beneficial to the firm's bottom line. "He's giving us ammunition that Dad can't easily dismiss," Isabel observed as we incorporated the findings into our presentation. Performance metrics speak a language even the most entrenched leadership can't ignore. By Sunday evening, we had assembled a comprehensive proposal that addressed every anticipated objection with concrete data, clear implementation pathways, and thoughtful transition plans for each department. More importantly, we had secured preliminary support from key executives who recognized the opportunity for genuine advancement under a merit-based system. Throughout this intensive preparation, I experienced something previously unfamiliar in my professional life: the energizing power of collaborative purpose. For years, I had worked in relative isolation, my contributions acknowledged but rarely built upon by others. The experience of creating something transformative alongside others who shared the vision brought a dimension of fulfillment entirely different from individual achievement. "You smile more now," Davis from Operations noted when we reviewed the department transition plans on Sunday afternoon. "Even in the middle of the biggest professional challenge of your career." His observation struck me as profoundly accurate. Despite the uncertainty and conflict inherent in challenging established power structures, I felt more centered and purposeful than I had in years. There was something fundamentally liberating about finally addressing systemic problems rather than continuously adapting to them. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. I dressed with deliberate intention, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet confidence and professional gravitas. The woman who had once tried to minimize her presence to avoid uncomfortable attention now prepared to command a boardroom with unwavering conviction. The meeting room filled gradually, conversation noticeably subdued as executives sensed the significance of the day's discussion. My father entered last, flanked by Gregory and 2 board members, his expression revealing nothing of the pressure he surely felt. "After reviewing both proposals and consulting extensively with our board," he began, his voice measured and authoritative, "I've prepared a response that addresses key governance concerns while ensuring operational continuity." Gregory distributed documents outlining what appeared to be minor modifications to the existing leadership structure, cosmetic adjustments that acknowledged shareholder rights without actually redistributing decision-making authority. The message was clear. My father was offering the minimum concessions he believed necessary to maintain essential control. "These changes preserve our proven leadership model while incorporating appropriate oversight mechanisms," he continued, emphasis on proven revealing his fundamental position, that current challenges represented technical governance issues rather than substantive leadership questions. When he finished, my father turned to me with an expression that combined confidence with the faintest suggestion of condescension. "Victoria, I trust these adjustments address your primary concerns as a significant shareholder." The room's attention shifted, everyone anticipating direct confrontation based on our previous interactions. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully before responding. Thank you for these proposed modifications. They represent movement toward more inclusive governance. I deliberately used measured language before continuing. Before offering specific responses, I believe Isabel has relevant perspectives to share that may inform our discussion. My father's momentary confusion was evident. In his mental framework, Isabel remained fundamentally aligned with him despite her unexpected support during our previous meeting. He still viewed our relationship through the lens of competition rather than collaboration. Thank you, Victoria, Isabel began, her polished presentation style now grounded in substantive content rather than mere impression management. While these governance adjustments are noted, our extensive discussions with department leaders have revealed more fundamental opportunities for organizational improvement that would benefit all stakeholders, including our clients, whose interests must remain paramount. She launched into our prepared presentation with confident precision, outlining the distributed leadership model, with its emphasis on performance-based advancement and collaborative decision-making. As she spoke, I observed the executive's reactions. Genuine interest from most, cautious neutrality from those most closely aligned with my father, and growing recognition that this represented far more than a power struggle between family members. Perhaps most importantly, Isabel emphasized, this approach creates clear advancement pathways based on demonstrated capability rather than position or tenure. Every member of our team would have defined metrics for evaluation and development, opportunities aligned with their specific strengths. When she completed her portion, I continued seamlessly with the financial and operational details, presenting projected outcomes, implementation timelines, and risk mitigation strategies. Our carefully rehearsed handoff demonstrated the very collaborative approach we were advocating. Throughout our presentation, my father maintained a neutral expression, though his tightening jaw revealed growing tension. When we concluded, he waited several moments before responding. This is certainly comprehensive, he acknowledged carefully. However, it represents a dramatic departure from the leadership approach that has built our success. Change of this magnitude introduces significant organizational risk. With respect, I countered. Our analysis indicates the greater risk lies in maintaining current structures, despite evolving market conditions and client expectations. The data demonstrates that firms with distributed decision-making models have consistently outperformed traditionally hierarchical organizations in our industry over the past decade. I displayed comparative performance metrics across wealth management firms with different governance structures. This isn't about rejecting what's worked in the past. It's about evolving to ensure continued success for the next 30 years. Of Donovan Financial. As multiple executives voiced support for specific elements of our proposal, the momentum in the room shifted perceptibly. What my father had anticipated as a formality to ratify his minimally modified approach had transformed into substantive discussion of fundamental organizational design. Gregory, ever attuned to shifting dynamics, intervened with characteristic pragmatism. Both approaches have merit. Perhaps the most productive next step would be for Richard to meet with Victoria and Isabel to develop a synthesis incorporating the strongest elements of each proposal. My father recognized this suggestion, as the face-saving measure it was, an opportunity to maintain involvement in a process clearly moving beyond his initial parameters. That seems reasonable. We could convene a working group. Actually, I interjected with quiet confidence, Isabel and I have already prepared an integration framework that might serve as a starting point for that discussion. The transition plan we distributed preserved meaningful roles for all current executives, including my father, while establishing clear pathways to implement the new leadership model. This prepared response to his anticipated suggestion demonstrated strategic foresight that visibly surprised him. For perhaps the first time, my father was encountering not just my analytical capabilities, but my strategic vision, dimensions of leadership he had assumed I lacked. The realization registered in his expression, a complex mixture of irritation, surprise, and something less easily defined, perhaps the beginning of genuine reassessment. "We've been thorough," I explained simply. "This restructuring represents the most significant organizational change since Grandpa transferred leadership to you. It deserves comprehensive preparation." As the meeting concluded with agreement to reconvene after everyone had reviewed the integration framework, I experienced not triumph, but something more sustainable: the quiet satisfaction of having transformed wool socks into a catalyst for meaningful change, not just for myself, but for an entire organization ready to evolve beyond the limitations of its past. The 3 days following our presentation became a delicate dance of diplomacy and strategic positioning. Word spread quickly throughout the firm that significant changes were under consideration, creating a mixture of excitement and anxiety among staff. To address emerging concerns, Isabel and I hosted informal information sessions where employees could ask questions about the potential restructuring. These gatherings revealed something illuminating. While most executives had aligned with my father's centralized leadership model, the broader employee base overwhelmingly favored a more merit-based system. "I've been here 7 years without a clear advancement path," shared one investment analyst during Wednesday's lunch session. "I've watched 3 less qualified people move ahead of me because they played golf with your father or attended the right schools. If what you're proposing actually creates objective performance metrics, I'd finally have a real chance." Stories like this emerged repeatedly, painting a picture of systemic inequity far beyond my personal experience. What I had viewed primarily as familial favoritism was, in fact, a pervasive organizational culture that undermined talent development throughout the firm. Each conversation strengthened my conviction that our proposed changes addressed fundamental business needs, not merely personal grievances. During this period, my father maintained strategic distance, communicating primarily through Gregory, rather than engaging directly. This approach was characteristic. When unable to control a situation, he typically withdrew to regroup, rather than risk direct confrontation on unfavorable terms. On Thursday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Westfield Technologies' CFO, our recently secured institutional client. "Victoria, I'll be direct," he began. "We've heard rumors about potential leadership changes at Donovan Financial. Given that your investment strategy was the primary reason we selected your firm, we'd like reassurance about continuity." This client concern represented exactly the leverage my father would typically use to resist change: the argument that organizational stability was paramount to client confidence. However, it also presented an opportunity to demonstrate the client benefits of our proposed restructuring. "I appreciate your directness," I replied. "Yes, we're evaluating governance improvements that would actually strengthen our investment operations. The changes under consideration would formalize my authority over investment strategy while creating more robust performance accountability across all departments. Your portfolio would remain under my direct oversight with enhanced supporting resources." "That sounds like a positive development from our perspective," he acknowledged. "We selected Donovan Financial largely based on your approach, not just the firm's general reputation. I'd be happy to schedule a detailed briefing once our restructuring is finalized," I offered. Transparency with key clients is essential during transitions. After the call, I informed Isabel about this development. "We should proactively contact our top 20 institutional clients with similar messages," she suggested. "If they express support for the restructuring, it neutralizes Dad's argument that changes would threaten client relationships." Her strategic thinking impressed me. She was applying her relationship management expertise towards systematic stakeholder engagement rather than merely personal advantage. By Friday morning, we had secured explicit support from 16 major clients representing over $800 million in assets under management. effectively eliminating client concern as a viable objection to our proposed changes. Friday afternoon brought another unexpected development when Margaret appeared at my office door. "Your father would like to meet privately before Monday's general session," she informed me. "Sunday evening at his home. He specifically requested that you come alone." This invitation represented a significant tactical shift. My father clearly recognized that his position had weakened and was now seeking private negotiation where his personal influence might prove more effective than formal business arguments. "Did he extend the same invitation to Isabel?" I inquired. "He plans to meet with her separately tomorrow," Margaret confirmed, her neutral expression revealing nothing of her own perspective. I considered the implications carefully. Separate meetings suggested an attempt to divide and conquer, to negotiate different terms with each of us and potentially undermine our unified position. The approach revealed both desperation and a fundamental misunderstanding of what had changed over the past 2 weeks. He still viewed our collaboration as a temporary alliance of convenience, rather than a genuine reconciliation of previously competing perspectives. "Please tell him I'll be there," I replied. "And Margaret, thank you for your discretion throughout this process." Her professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing a hint of satisfaction. "Some changes have been needed for a very long time, Ms. Donovan." Saturday evening, Isabel called after her meeting with our father. 3 hours of emotional manipulation wrapped in business rationalization, she reported, sounding exhausted but resolute. "He offered me a special advisory role with expanded authority over client relationships if I'd support his modified governance proposal instead of our restructuring plan." "Did he explicitly ask you to break ranks with me?" I asked. "Not in those exact words, but the implication was clear, that you're forcing radical changes while he's offering reasonable compromise." She sighed audibly. "The thing is, Victoria, 2 weeks ago I might have accepted his framing. Now I can't unsee the patterns we've documented. He kept talking about appropriate roles and natural strengths in ways that suddenly sound like carefully crafted limitations." Her perspective shift represented perhaps the most meaningful victory in our campaign for change. Not just structural realignment, but fundamental reassessment of assumptions about capability and opportunity. "How did you leave things?" I asked. "I told him I would consider his concerns but remained committed to merit-based advancement for everyone, including family members." Pride colored her voice. "I actually used the phrase ethical leadership requires consistent standards across all levels. I think I shocked him." Sunday evening arrived with crystalline winter clarity, the drive to my parents' home accompanied by spectacular sunset colors painting the snow-covered landscape. This beauty provided valuable perspective. Regardless of tonight's conversation, life contained dimensions far beyond corporate politics and family dynamics. My mother answered the door with her characteristic hostess smile. "Victoria, punctual. As always, your father's in his study." The formal sitting room had been bypassed in favor of my father's personal domain, a calculated choice that placed me in his territory rather than neutral ground. His study remained unchanged from my childhood memories. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound business texts lining built-in shelves, and the imposing oak desk where he had conducted both family business and corporate affairs for decades. "Thank you for coming," he began, gesturing toward the leather chair positioned before his desk. His tone carried forced cordiality, the voice he used with difficult clients rather than family members. I selected a different seat, the more comfortable armchair in the corner where visiting colleagues typically sat during informal discussions. This small assertion of independence didn't go unnoticed, his expression tightening momentarily before he adjusted. "I've given careful consideration to the restructuring proposal," he continued, moving to sit opposite me rather than maintain the desk barrier. "While certain elements have merit, I remain concerned about implementation risks during a a time when market volatility requires stable leadership. This opening represented his standard negotiation approach, acknowledging enough of the opposing position to appear reasonable while framing his resistance as prudent caution rather than simple opposition to change. Market volatility actually underscores the need for diversified leadership perspectives, I countered. Multiple viewpoints create more robust risk assessment than single-point decision-making, particularly during uncertain conditions. My father nodded as if considering this perspective for the first time, though we had explicitly addressed this point in our presentation. A fair observation. Perhaps we could implement changes gradually, beginning with expanded authority for department heads while maintaining the existing executive structure during transition. This suggestion reflected classic dilution strategy, accepting change in principle while extending timelines indefinitely, ensuring the status quo remained effectively intact. Before I could respond, he continued with unexpected directness. Victoria, I've always valued your analytical contributions. Your investment strategies have consistently outperformed benchmarks, and your operational improvements have enhanced profitability. These talents are invaluable to the firm. The explicit acknowledgement of my contributions, something historically rare from my father, signaled the seriousness of his concern about the current situation. However, his framing remained revealing. He recognized my technical capabilities, while implicitly distinguishing them from leadership qualities. Those contributions came despite constraints, not because of them, I replied evenly. Imagine what our entire organization could accomplish if everyone operated with appropriate authority, aligned with their capabilities, rather than predetermined limitations. My father leaned forward, abandoning pretense for direct engagement. Let me speak plainly. You've orchestrated a significant power realignment using your grandfather's shareholding transfer. That was well executed. You've built unexpected alliance with your sister. Also impressive. You've secured client and staff support for organizational changes. Strategically sound. He paused, studying me with new assessment in his gaze. These actions demonstrate precisely the leadership capabilities I didn't believe you possessed. The question now isn't whether you can lead, but what kind of leader you intend to be. Will you dismantle what I've built out of personal resentment? Or will you consider an approach that preserves institutional knowledge while creating the advancement opportunities you advocate? The question cut to the heart of both his concern and my intention. Was this about revenge or reform, about personal validation or organizational improvement? This restructuring isn't about dismantling your legacy, I answered truthfully. It's about building upon the foundation while addressing systemic limitations that restrict our future growth potential. The distributed leadership model incorporates your strengths in client relationships and strategic vision while opening advancement pathways previously blocked by centralized authority. And my role in this new structure? He asked, the question that truly concerned him. Executive chairman focused on key client relationships, strategic partnerships, and board governance, areas where your experience and reputation create genuine competitive advantage for the firm. I outlined specific responsibilities and authority parameters we had carefully designed to utilize his strengths while limiting his ability to undermine meritocratic advancement throughout the organization. As I detailed this vision, something shifted in my father's expression. Not acceptance yet, but recognition that the proposal offered him dignity and purpose rather than mere consolation. For perhaps the first time, he was encountering me as a thoughtful strategist rather than a technical specialist, capable of designing solutions that addressed complex human dynamics alongside organizational requirements. Our conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, moving beyond position statements to genuine dialogue about organizational philosophy, leadership development, and family legacy. Though we reached no definitive agreement, the discussion established new ground rules for Monday's formal meeting, an understanding that substantive change would occur, with negotiation focused on implementation approaches rather than whether transformation would proceed. As I prepared to leave, my father said something unexpected. Your grandfather predicted this moment years ago. He told me I was underestimating you in ways I would eventually regret. A rueful smile briefly crossed his face. I should have listened more carefully. Driving home through the quiet winter night, I reflected on our conversation with mixed emotions. My father's acknowledgement of my capabilities, however belatedly offered, provided a certain satisfaction. Yet more meaningful was the recognition that our restructuring efforts had transcended personal vindication to address fundamental organizational needs. The BMW versus Sox Christmas had functioned as catalyst, but the transformation now underway extended far beyond addressing familial favoritism. We were creating an organization where contribution determined advancement for everyone, where capability rather than connection established authority, and where leadership meant developing others' potential rather than limiting it to maintain control. Monday's meeting would undoubtedly bring continued negotiation and compromise. Implementation would require sustained effort against entrenched patterns. Yet the fundamental shift had already occurred, not just in organizational structure, but in my relationship with my own potential. I had moved from adaptation within constraints to creation beyond them, from accepting imposed limitations to designing systems that enabled both personal and collective flourishing. Sometimes the most profound transformation begins with the simplest catalyst, even something as mundane as Christmas socks that finally render visible patterns long accepted but ultimately unsustainable. The question was never really about equitable gift-giving, but about recognizing full human potential, not just for myself, but for everyone whose capabilities had been systematically undervalued within systems designed for preservation rather than growth. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight I savored quiet confidence in a future where merit mattered more than last names, where contribution earned corresponding recognition, and where leadership meant creating opportunity rather than controlling access to it. Monday morning brought crystalline winter sunshine streaming through the boardroom windows, illuminating the space with unexpected brilliance. I arrived 30 minutes early to prepare, finding my grandfather already seated at the far end of the table, reviewing documents with characteristic intensity. I thought you might appreciate moral support, he explained, glancing up with a small smile. Today represents a significant transition point, not just for the organization, but for you personally. His observation captured something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Beyond the governance restructuring and operational changes, today marked my emergence from the shadows of underestimation into the full light of recognized capability. Thank you for being here, I said simply, taking the seat beside him. I wouldn't miss it. He closed his folder with deliberate precision. Your father called me last night after your conversation. He seemed recalibrated. That's an apt description, I acknowledged. Not fully converted to our approach, but engaging with it as legitimate rather than merely oppositional. My grandfather nodded thoughtfully. In 40 years of business leadership, I've observed that genuine organizational transformation requires 3 components: structural change, systems adjustments, and psychological shift. You've designed excellent structural and systems improvements. Yesterday may have initiated the psychological component that will determine whether implementation succeeds or faces continuous underground resistance. His framework provided valuable perspective on the work ahead. Technical solutions alone wouldn't address the cultural dimensions of transformation. The boardroom gradually filled with executives and key stakeholders. Isabel arrived with uncharacteristic punctuality, dressed professionally but without her usual emphasis on fashion-forward styling, a subtle signal of seriousness that didn't go unnoticed. My father entered last, accompanied by Gregory and 2 board members, his expression revealing little of his current thinking. Good morning, he began formally. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I'd like to share some reflections on the restructuring proposals we've been considering. The room quieted completely, everyone recognizing the significance of his opening framing. For 30 years, I've led Donovan Financial according to principles I believed would ensure stability and continuity. I implemented governance approaches that emphasized centralized decision-making and clear authority structures. He paused, surveying the assembled executives. These methods served us well during certain phases of organizational development. However, I've been persuaded that evolving market conditions and growth objectives require corresponding evolution in our leadership approach. This acknowledgement, however carefully worded, represented significant movement from his previous resistance. Several executives exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting this opening stance. After extensive consultation with key stakeholders, including major clients, board members, and senior leadership, I'm prepared to support implementing a modified version of the distributed leadership model proposed by Victoria and Isabel. He gestured toward Gregory, who distributed revised documents to everyone present. These materials outline the recommended governance structure, with implementation timelines and transition protocols. I reviewed the document quickly, noting that while he had adjusted certain reporting relationships and authority parameters, the essential elements of our proposal remained intact. Performance-based advancement pathways, collaborative decision-making, processes, and objectively measured leadership accountability. The recommended structure creates a leadership council comprising department heads with clearly defined authority in their respective domains, my father continued. This council will function with collective responsibility for strategic decisions, while maintaining specialized expertise in operational execution. As he outlined the proposed implementation approach, I observed something remarkable in his presentation style. Though the language remained characteristically formal, he was presenting the restructuring as an organizational advancement rather than a personal concession, framing change as progressive evolution rather than remedial correction. This approach preserved his dignity while enabling necessary transformation. When he finished the overview, my father turned toward me with an expression I hadn't seen before, one that combined professional respect with something approaching paternal recognition. Victoria has been appointed chair of the Leadership Council, with primary responsibility for investment strategy and organizational development. This was not a position we had explicitly included in our proposal. It represented his own addition to the structure. Her demonstrated analytical capabilities and strategic vision make her uniquely qualified for this role. The acknowledgement of strategic vision, the very quality he had previously insisted I lacked, represented perhaps the most meaningful aspect of his presentation. Not just acceptance of structural change, but explicit recognition of capabilities long dismissed. Isabel will serve as Client Experience Director, leveraging her relationship management strengths and communication expertise to ensure our service delivery meets evolving client expectations. He nodded toward my sister, whose expression revealed genuine satisfaction with this role alignment. Her ability to translate complex financial concepts into accessible client communications represents a distinctive competitive advantage for our firm. As he continued outlining leadership appointments, I noted that each executive was being positioned according to their actual strengths rather than historical relationships or tenure, a fundamental shift from previous advancement patterns. I will transition to executive chairman, focusing on key institutional relationships, strategic partnerships, and board governance. He described specific responsibilities that honored his experience while constraining his ability to override the distributed decision-making model, essentially the framework I had proposed during our Sunday conversation. When he concluded the presentation, the room remained momentarily silent, everyone processing the significance of what had been proposed. This wasn't merely structural reorganization, but fundamental reorientation of the organization's approach to leadership, advancement, and decision-making. Gregory spoke first, his legal perspective cutting to practical implementation. The proposal appears comprehensive, particularly regarding transition protocols. However, I recommend establishing specific milestone reviews at 30, 90, and 180 days to assess progress and address any emerging challenges. An excellent suggestion, my father agreed. Victoria, would you take responsibility for designing those review protocols? Of course, I responded, maintaining professional composure despite the quiet satisfaction of being asked to lead this critical component. I'll work with the department heads to establish appropriate metrics for each milestone. What followed was remarkably constructive discussion of implementation details, questions of timeline sequencing, communication strategy, and authority transitions during the interim period. Throughout the conversation, I observed my father consistently deferring to relevant expertise rather than imposing his preferences, modeling the collaborative approach he had just endorsed. Near the meeting's conclusion, Davis from operations raised an important question. This represents significant cultural change. How do we ensure alignment throughout the organization, not just at leadership levels? An essential consideration, I acknowledged. We've developed a comprehensive communication and engagement strategy that includes department-specific town halls, transparent sharing of performance metrics, and regular progress updates. I outlined the approach Isabel and I had developed, emphasizing employee involvement in refining implementation details relevant to their specific functions. Cultural transformation requires both systematic communication and meaningful involvement, Isabel added. People support what they help create. Our approach incorporates structured feedback mechanisms at each implementation stage. Throughout this exchange, my grandfather remained silent but attentive, his expression revealing quiet satisfaction as the organization he had founded decades earlier prepared for its most significant evolution since his retirement. When the formal meeting concluded, he approached me as executives gathered in small groups discussing implementation implications. You've initiated meaningful transformation, he observed quietly. Not just in governance structures, but in fundamental assumptions about capability and contribution. We've taken first steps, I acknowledged. Implementation will determine whether changes become embedded or remain superficial. True, but don't underestimate what's already been accomplished. He nodded toward my father, now engaged in conversation, with Isabel and 2 department heads. Richard has made psychological shift that seemed impossible 2 weeks ago. Your strategic approach, focusing on organizational benefit rather than personal vindication, created space for his evolution, without humiliation. This perspective helped me appreciate dimensions of our progress beyond formal restructuring. The most significant changes weren't captured in organizational charts or governance documents, but in altered perceptions about capability, contribution, and leadership itself. As my grandfather departed for another appointment, my father approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. Do you have a moment? I'd like to discuss the communications rollout. We moved to a quiet corner of the room, our first semi-private conversation since Sunday's extensive dialogue. The announcement to employees should come from both of us, he suggested, demonstrating unified commitment to the new direction. I agree completely, I replied. Would tomorrow's all-staff meeting be appropriate timing? He nodded, then hesitated before continuing. There's another matter I'd like to address, though it's somewhat peripheral to the organizational changes. His uncharacteristic uncertainty piqued my curiosity. What's on your mind? Your Christmas gift, he said finally, the unexpected subject momentarily catching me off guard. The socks. Of all the topics I might have anticipated, this wasn't among them. That's not necessary. It is, he interrupted firmly. I've been reflecting on the symbolism beyond the items themselves. The disparity represented something systematic rather than incidental, a pattern of differential recognition that extended far beyond holiday gifts. His acknowledgement of this fundamental imbalance The very pattern I had identified but never expected him to recognize rendered me momentarily speechless. "I can't rewrite history," he continued when I didn't immediately respond. "But I can acknowledge that your contributions have been consistently undervalued, not just by me, but by organizational systems I created and maintained. That recognition gap reflected my limitations, not yours." This statement, delivered without excuses or qualifications, represented something I had never truly expected: genuine recognition of the systemic nature of the disparities I had experienced. Not mere acknowledgement of isolated incidents, but understanding of their cumulative impact and structural foundations. "Thank you for that recognition," I said finally. "It matters more than any material compensation could." "Nevertheless," he replied with unexpected humility, "meaningful recognition includes tangible dimensions. I've instructed Gregory to prepare equity transfer documents awarding you an additional 10% ownership stake from my personal holdings, bringing your total position to 35%. The significance of this transfer extended far beyond financial value, substantial though that was. It represented concrete acknowledgement of my contributions and capabilities, material recognition following verbal acknowledgement. "This isn't necessary for the restructuring to proceed," I noted carefully. "It's not about the restructuring," he clarified. "It's about appropriate recognition of value creation that should have been acknowledged long ago. The Leadership Council structure would proceed regardless. This addresses separate matters of equity and contribution recognition. As we discussed, implementation details for the next day's announcement. I observed subtle but meaningful changes in our interaction patterns. My father listened more attentively, acknowledged perspectives he would previously have dismissed, and engaged in genuine dialogue rather than directive communication. Later that afternoon, Isabel stopped by my office, closing the door behind her for privacy. Did that actually happen this morning? Did Dad genuinely support comprehensive restructuring, or did I hallucinate the entire meeting? I smiled at her characteristically dramatic framing. It happened, though I suspect we'll encounter implementation challenges as theoretical support confronts practical adjustment requirements. Of course, she agreed. But still, this represents fundamental paradigm shift, and your appointment as Leadership Council Chair. She shook her head with genuine admiration. You navigated this entire situation masterfully, Victoria, balancing organizational needs with interpersonal dynamics, maintaining principled positions without creating unnecessary conflict. We navigated it together, I corrected. Your contribution was essential, particularly in stakeholder engagement and communication strategy. Her expression turned reflective. I've been thinking about Christmas morning, the BMW versus socks moment. At the time, I didn't even register the disparity. That obliviousness was its own kind of privilege, wasn't it? The luxury of never questioning whether recognition was proportionate to contribution. This self-awareness represented perhaps the most meaningful dimension of our shared journey. Not just structural reorganization or role realignment, but fundamental reassessment of assumptions about merit, recognition, and opportunity. The restructuring provides framework for different patterns moving forward, I observed. For everyone, not just family members. Isabel nodded thoughtfully. I met with my team this morning to discuss what performance-based advancement actually means in practical terms. The energy in the room was extraordinary. People who have felt systematically overlooked suddenly seeing genuine opportunity based on capability rather than connection. This ripple effect, extending beyond personal vindication to systemic improvement affecting dozens of colleagues, represented the transformation's most meaningful dimension. What had begun as response to personal inequity had evolved into organizational renewal that would create opportunity for countless others facing similar barriers. As evening approached, I stood at my office window watching winter darkness settle over the city. The transformation process had only begun. With implementation, challenges and cultural resistance certainly awaiting us in coming months. Yet something fundamental had shifted, not just in governance structures or reporting relationships, but in core assumptions about capability, contribution, and recognition. Sometimes transformation begins with small catalysts, even something as mundane as Christmas socks that finally render visible patterns long accepted but ultimately unsustainable. What matters isn't the initial spark, but the constructive direction of the resulting energy, channeling legitimate frustration towards systematic improvement rather than personal vengeance, creating structures that expand opportunity rather than merely correcting individual injustice. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight I embraced quiet confidence in our direction, not triumphalism about personal advancement, but commitment to creating an organization where merit determined opportunity, contribution earned proportionate, recognition and leadership meant developing others' potential rather than limiting it to maintain control. The BMW versus Sox Christmas had initiated something far more significant than family drama or corporate restructuring. It had catalyzed transformation from accommodation within constraints to creation beyond them, not just for me, but for an entire organization ready to evolve beyond the limitations of its past. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.